Today we're going to talk about the Collaborative Planning Methodology, or CPM. As we've talked about in some of the other videos, there's a real movement afoot to reposition a lot of these OCIOs to be much more customer-facing and much more customer-focused. The Collaborative Planning Methodology is one of the pieces of this equation. There are new organizational designs that are taking place at some agencies, and we've talked about in the other videos. There's new philosophies in terms of how to deliver services to the end user customers from these OCIOs. The real question of how to actually do integrated planning and how to receive requirements from customers, plan for those, and then deliver those into an implementation mode is what's addressed in the collaborative planning methodology. So let's talk a little bit about the CPM. We'll talk a little bit about the Federal Enterprise Architecture version 2 and how these pieces are really designed in order to facilitate an improvement of services being delivered from the OCIOs to the mission customers themselves. So as I mentioned, a major enabler of becoming more customer focused is going to be this FEA version 2, Federal Enterprise Architecture version 2. Now the FEA version 2 is really being designed as a shot in the arm of the discipline of planning in the federal sector. Over the last few years, planning as a discipline has really taken a back seat to rapid fire doing. And I think as we've seen, there's kind of two extremes. There's planning without ever going anywhere. There's doing without really having a plan. And I think what we've seen is now the beginning of a period where proper integrated planning, being aligned with a nimble execution of those plans, is really kind of the optimum point that people are looking for. So the Federal Enterprise Architecture version 2 is designed to be something that resurrects the architecture discipline, but then also redefines the architecture discipline as something that's much more planning oriented. So the FEA version 2 consists of three efforts. There's the Federal Enterprise Architecture reference models that we'll talk about in a moment. There is the new Federal Enterprise Architecture framework that we'll talk about in a moment. And then there's the evolution of the federal segment architecture methodology. And the output of this evolution of the FSAM is the CPM. We'll talk about that extensively. The real nice thing about the Federal Enterprise Architecture version 2 is some of the summary pieces that were put together in the Common Approach to Enterprise Architecture that was published out. And in the Common Approach to Enterprise Architecture, they did a couple of things. They introduced some of the new reference models, they introduced the new framework, they introduced the CPM, but they also provided a nice summary of the four primary outcomes of architecture. A lot of times, as we've talked about in some of the other videos, a lot of times architecture programs become way too focused in on documentation or way too insular in how they're doing business. What the Common Approach to Enterprise Architecture document did, which I thought was really nice, is it nailed down the four primary outcomes of doing architecture. These are the things that we expect to get by doing architecture work. The first is service delivery. So the actual production or distribution of services from the government to citizens is the primary issue at hand. Focusing in on service delivery as being an outcome of architecture, I think, is an important component part of showing that architecture, first and foremost, needs to be about delivery of services to the citizens. Second is functional integration. How do things actually need to work together? A real primary outcome of enterprise architecture is putting things together so that they can work together. We have situations like the recreation community at Interior that will sell campground passes at locations that are currently within a wildland fire watch zone. These are things that are two pieces of two different functions that exist within Department of the Interior, wildland fire tracking and recreation permit sales, that need to come together so that that functional integration can deliver a better service to the citizen. The third is resource optimization. There's a lot of focus on resource optimization these days. We've got a lot of focus on cutting costs in IT, reducing data centers, and those sorts of things. Resource optimization is really important, although it's not the only thing that's important. And I think it's nice that it's set in context of service delivery and functional integration here. Lastly, we have authoritative reference. There are a lot of architecture programs that think that authoritative reference is, in fact, the only reason they exist, to document things. I like the fact that it's here because documenting what's going on and where we're trying to go is a major part of the architecture discipline. But I also like the fact that it's set in context of these other three primary outcomes that are very important. The most important thing that's happening here is that the discipline of IT planning is being refreshed for practical use within the federal sector. So we're re-looking at planning and we're trying to make it more nimble and more approachable and more practical for the uses within the federal sector. And that's a big deal. So reacting to customer needs requires that IT planners can operate at lots of levels of scope. This is a very kind of confusing diagram, if you will, because there's lots of things going on. But when you really break it down into component parts, there's a lot of really good data that's here. You see these rectangles that are around the outside rings, and those are the four primary outcomes that we talked about in the last slide: service delivery, functional integration, resource optimization, authoritative reference. Then the outer ring, you see national, international, federal, sector, segment, application, system, agency. These are what OMB is calling the levels of scope. What they're saying is that architects can't just be enterprise architects or segment architects or application architects. The architecture discipline, being a planning discipline, needs to be able to have methodologies and tools and competencies that can help with planning at all these layers of scope. We will deal with international issues, standards, all the way down through to system and application level issues. And we have to be able to accommodate requirements coming in from our mission customers that are geared towards these levels of scope. And we have to be able to meet those needs with proper plans that are designed out for those levels of scope. What that means is that our component parts or our toolkit needs to include all the capabilities to operate at these layers of scope, or these levels of scope. The ring on the inside of this is slightly akin to our building blocks that we at Phase 1 have championed before, the building blocks of a good program. These are slightly kind of geared towards that. You have things like governance and principles and methods and tools and standards that are all part of our building blocks. And then there's use and reporting and audit, which also talk to some of the capabilities that need to exist in a program to have an effective architecture program. In the center, you see the new Federal Enterprise Architecture Framework. And this framework is generally called the Cube, and it's from Dr. Scott Bernard's book, and Dr. Bernard is the chief architect over at OMB. And the Cube represents the fact that there are segment views and there are an enterprise-wide roadmap that kind of ties these things together. What's really interesting here in the Cube is that they've now represented the new Federal Enterprise Architecture reference models. So we still have a strategic layer to the reference models in the performance reference model. We still have a business layer with the business reference model. And we still have a data and information layer with the data reference model. What you'll notice is that the technical reference model is now gone and has been replaced with the application reference model and the infrastructure reference model. And then the service reference model is gone, has now been replaced with a new SRM called the security controls reference model. So what we see is a dropping of the SRM and TRM, which were used in very kind of different types of ways around town, and really a focus in on applications and infrastructure being discretely different buckets of things with which we need to be aware. And then really the importance of security controls in the context of architecture. Now the focus on planning overall is designed to better enable the organizations, the OCIOs, to support the mission customers. The Federal Enterprise Architecture version 2, particularly a focus on the levels of scope and a focus in on the different reference models and the actual different layers, the different things that they're asking us to look at, are all important. But as we evolve the federal segment architecture methodology into the collaborative planning methodology, and we move more into a holistic integrated planning type of posture, we can see that we're really better positioned within our OCIO community to better deliver services directly into our mission customers. So here's a a few different roles that you typically find, within the IT decision-making process. So the CIO can really leverage some of the benefits of the FIA version 2 to formulate actionable plans for meeting mission needs. So the CIO should be able to turn to his or her planning organization and say, with the CPM and with the FIA version 2, I expect that you're going to bring me actionable plans for meeting my mission needs. Now the CFO can really expect that the rigor of that integrated planning approach has been put into place and is used to justify how we're going to spend what are becoming increasingly scarce financial resources. So a CFO can demand to see the type of integrated planning that's depicted in the FIA version 2 and how that integrated planning justifies the investment requests that are being made and put forward. And budget professionals can really leverage the planners to help justify budget formulation requests. I would expect that budget planners are interacting directly with, or budget professionals are interacting directly with the planners, the people who are actually working through the collaborative planning methodology to understand specifically why certain budget formulation requests are more important than others. The capital planners are one of the planning types, and they need to work more intimately with the other planners as part of the overall collaborative planning approach and the collaborative planning team. Historically, we've got records planners, enterprise architects, capital planners, infrastructure planners, security planners, and all these different types of planning disciplines need to work together as part of a collaborative effort to deliver an integrated plan for how the organization is going to move forward. And then project managers really should benefit from having a better procurements through better planning, and a more integrated and holistic look at the needs of the end users or the mission customers, how those needs can be met, and an integrated plan that allows for those needs to be met will deliver better procurements, which will help project managers deliver better implementations. So the evolved federal segment architecture methodology is now inclusive of this broader planning discipline. And I think what's really kind of the most important element here is that architecture has been recognized as being but one of many planning disciplines that need to work together. So we looked at FSAM and we thought about the name Federal Segment Architecture Methodology, and there were a few problems that were immediately called out by the agencies that came around the table to develop the CPM. The word federal was being used in FSAM, and this was an issue because there were agencies that were at the table, DoD and DHS and HHS and others, who were specifically worried that we work as a federal government at international layers of scope and with federal and state and federal and tribal and federal and local types of issues. Having something called the FSAM with the word federal in it made it seem too insular to our federal government when we really do work with lots of partners, even in the private sector. The word segment in FSAM really kind of deviated from the layer of scope perspective that OMB was bringing to the table. The segment concept was one that was too narrow. We had to be able to operate at an international layer of scope down into application layers of scope. And so we couldn't really stick with the word segment. Architecture was another word that was being used, and that was a concerning word because architecture had been branded as in some cases, a negative experience. And what we wanted to do was downplay architecture and upplay the concept of planning, which really kind of left us with with the methodology word, which is the only word from FSAM that actually carried forward. So we have this new name called Collaborative Planning Methodology. It really means a couple of things. Collaboratively has two interpretations here that are both valid. It means that the planners themselves need to work collaboratively together in order to plan for a mission need. This is that list of planners, architects and capital planners and infrastructure and security planners and budget planners and all these planners that need to work together collaboratively. The other thing that this also depicts, the word collaborative depicts, is that these planners need to work collaboratively with the mission customers themselves. So collaborative kind of has a double meaning here. Planning is really the focus. It's not about architecture. It's not about capital planning in 300s. It's about doing planning itself. And what that does is it gives us an environment where we're producing a plan, which is something that the mission customers can really understand and really buy into, rather than delivering an architecture or a 300 or some other type of compliance-oriented document. So the new scope is really about integrating these multidisciplinary planning activities all together, architecture being just but one of these planning disciplines. And the new focus is really geared towards all these different levels of scope. So real quickly, before we get into the methodology itself, so why does the federal government need its own methodology? I hear this asked quite often, and here's some reasons why it makes sense for the federal government to have its own methodology. First and foremost, architects can really more effectively engage one another when they're using the same methodology. When we have architects from different agencies or from different companies, for us to be able to work effectively to solve water quality issues between U.S. Geological Survey and the EPA, or law enforcement issues between DOJ and the intel communities, we need to have a standard methodology by which the planners are working together. Now, you could say, well, we could adopt a methodology, it's an international standard of some sort, or some type of corporate standard that's out there, but it's important that that we have something that as a federal community that we can embrace and train ourselves on. And second bullet here is that government architects can more effectively communicate expectations when there's a robust standard methodology that's government property. So this robust standard methodology is something that can be put into procurements and can be put into expectation setting. Budget people, as we talked about before, can say, I expect that integrated planning is going to have this degree of rigor. People that are going through procurements can say that I expect that I have contractors that are skilled in the way I do planning, which is this methodology. So that's very powerful. Third bullet is that contracted architects can be expected to work more closely together when they use the same non-proprietary methodology. So I've seen several instances of bigger firms with proprietary methods that don't play nice with other bigger firms or other smaller firms or anyone. And I just find that to be really offensive. If we have 2 or 3 or 10 different vendors that are working in an environment, those vendors need to be working seamlessly to a standard methodology that cuts across each of those companies and with no concept of proprietary methods being put into play. It just slows things down, it costs the government, the taxpayers more money, and it's not necessary. Solution architects, developers, and procurement specialists can better tailor their processes to the standard methodology. So when we get down into the detailed solution planning layers, the developers and people that are going through procurements, if we're working with a standard planning methodology, each of those other groups knows what they're going to expect and how they can actually tailor their own methods to the outputs that are coming from our standard planning method. Training of architecture practitioners can be standardized around the standard methodology. So we have lots of different training institutions, and they're great, and lots of different people that are talking about planning and talking about architecture. By having our own planning methodology, that's something that is adopted across the entire federal government, this allows for all those training institutions to prepare the future planners and the future architects given a standard approach. Ideally, people coming out of schools, and there's some universities that have already started teaching the FSAM and will likely be teaching the CPM. These schools are preparing people to come into the federal sector and federal service with a degree of rigor that didn't exist historically. And lastly, the EA community of practice can really innovate more quickly and significantly when working from the same standard methodology. So when we're starting to work with the CPM, tools, methods, governance, training, all these things that are feeding off of the standard methodology can really accelerate the pace with which we're innovating in our own community of practice. So here are the top 2 layers of the collaborative planning methodology. The CPM is really a method of methods inside of which other planning disciplines can connect. So inside of the CPM is where capital planning and architecture planning and solution planning and security planning and all these different types of planning disciplines can exist and coexist and work together in a collaborative way. So that's why we call it a method of methods. At the top, you see two main phases of the CPM: organize and plan, and implement and measure. And organize and plan is about getting organized around the mission needs, validating those needs and understanding other places where those needs may have been met, and then really putting the plan in place in order to meet those needs. Implement and measure is about exactly that: implementing the plan that was produced and then measuring performance given the plan that's been implemented. As you can see, these two phases really break down into 5 main steps. Identify and validate is step 1. Research and leverage is step 2. Define and plan is step 3. Invest and execute is step 4. And perform and measure is step 5. So identify and validate, step 1. The purpose here is to really understand what the leadership and stakeholders really need to achieve, analyzing major drivers for that change, and identifying and initiating appropriate governance to meet those needs. So leadership is going to be in a situation where they're going to tell us that they need something. It can be, I need to save money on my IT hosting costs. I need to have fewer injured police officers that are on the job. I need to have wildland fire operations that are more effective. They're going to give us big, broad expectations that then we need to work with the stakeholders and kind of the operational managers and the solutions types of folks to really understand what it is that's being said. So if we hear about fewer injured police officers as being the primary leadership objective, in step 1, we understand that objective. We work with stakeholders to understand what's behind that. And what's behind that is, in this particular case, might be a need for interoperability of radio equipment. So step 1 is about understanding the leadership intent, working with stakeholders and really drilling into the drivers and understanding what really is intended, what really can get to the leadership intent. Working with the right governance groups, either standing up a new governance group or working with an existing governance group to then carry back this interpretation and to get sign-off out of step 1 that says that our understanding is the leadership intent is to have fewer injured police officers, and our interpretation of that is that we're going to work on integrated radio equipment as being a primary driver of that and getting sign-off on that. Now, step 2 is called research and leverage. Step 2 is really designed towards understanding whether or not this problem has been solved in other places previously. So for step 2, we really identify other organizations that have met or are currently facing similar needs, and we analyze their experiences and their results. It's important to recognize that at this point, we're not really talking about reuse of solutions. What we're doing is we're trying to see, has somebody else worked on interoperability of radios before? Or is somebody else working on interoperability of radios today? And what type of experiences and results did they encounter? They may have found a wonderful solution that potentially can work into our planning in step 3. They may have found a debacle that has to be taken into consideration in step 3. In step 2, this is where we really drill into not only looking at people that have encountered similar problems, but maybe even people that have done so in different industries altogether. So we may look at radio interoperability from a law enforcement perspective and other law enforcement providers, maybe at a state or local level. We may also look at interoperability in the oil industry or interoperability of radio equipment in some other industry that where this comes to play. The point being is that before we start and embark on our planning efforts in step 3, we really want to have a research and discovery phase to understand, are there experiences and results that we should be taking into consideration when we do our planning? Step 3 is the heavy planning step of the methodology. Most of the traditional FSAM planning activities around performance and business and system and technology oriented planning you find in step 3. Define and plan is about getting the right planners together with the mission specialists and really developing out the integrated plans that are needed to be put into place to meet those stated needs from step 1. This is where we're getting all of the planners together, we're really looking at the needs and we're saying, okay, what degree of planning, what degree of rigor is just enough planning, just in time, in order to meet the needs that have been identified in step one. This is also where we identify what type of compliance documents are needed. Do we need changes to the enterprise roadmap? Do we need an Exhibit 300? Are there CNA changes that might be coming into play here? By identifying those types of compliance documents up front, we make sure to get the right planners in the room at the right times. And although the main driver, the main output of step three is the integrated plan, also out of step three is where we get our compliance documents like Exhibit 300. Step four is around investing and executing. This is where the investment decision is actually made, and this is where the implementation of the changes actually takes place. So this is where we take the outputs from step three and the understanding we built in steps 1, 2, and 3, and we make our investment decision and then we implement. And step 5 is around operating the mission with the new capabilities in place and then really measuring to see the mission benefits that have been achieved through this planning initiative. This is the next layer of decomposition of the CPM. The CPM actually goes down another layer even beyond this. There's a full document that exists and is available online. And the full document really spells out to a very low level of detail the collaborative planning methodology and its intentions. So this shows our 3 levels of decomposition, from the top level of organize and plan and implement and measure, and then 5 steps. And each of those 5 steps then has a decomposition that is in place. You can pause the video at this point and kind of go through each of these blocks, but I'll go through them briefly and carry you through a little bit of dialogue in each. In step 1, like we talked about, we engage our sponsor, we assess the stakeholder needs, then we analyze and we really validate those needs to make sure we understand what's really intended, like we talked about. And then we formulate the case to address those needs. We think we're going to address the needs through interoperability of radios, and here's our approach. And then we identify and engage governance to make sure that we've got buy-in to how we're planning on approaching these needs. In step 2, in research and leverage, this is where we identify organizations and service providers that we need to engage. And we analyze opportunities that we might have to leverage their experiences and their results. We think this is applicable, we think this is not applicable. And we determine whether or not to leverage those experiences and results. Not everything is going to be valid, and we need to make a determination as to what feeds into step 3, into the planning step. In step 3, we have define and plan. This is where we formalize the collaborative planning team, and we really launch the core planning. We refine the vision for performance and outcomes now based on what we validated in step 1, what we've learned in step 2. We get that team together in step 3, and we really refine the vision for what it is that we're going to achieve. And then we analyze the current state, determine adjustments, and plan for the target state in 3.3. And this is where we have a lot of the FSAM types of activities, where we're looking at our current environment and we're documenting what adjustments need to be made and how that's going to look in the target state environment. Then we formulate the integrated plan and roadmap for consideration for decision making, and then we initiate execution governance, or how the actual governance of the plan would actually be overseen during an execution or an implementation phase of the project. Then in steps 4 and 5, you see that these substeps are in white, meaning that we didn't do a full decomposition against these activities. We wrote to these activities methodologically, and there's coverage from that standpoint. However, investment and execution and performance and measurement steps are going to be very agency specific, depending on SDLC life cycles and depending on performance measurement activities in those agencies. But here's roughly what's going on in these activities. In step 4, we define out that funding strategy. We make a decision about whether we're going to invest in the plans from step 3 and how those will be funded. Then we obtain resources and we validate those plans through those resources. So this is where we go out to procurement and get the resources we need and really validate, now that we've got procured resources, how we're going to then go through the execution. And then, of course, we execute against that plan. In step 5, we operate with the new capabilities and we measure performance against those metrics. And then we analyze and provide feedback to back into the planning cycle, so we can get an understanding about whether our planning cycle was effective or not. So just like with the FCM, the CPM is a complete toolkit. There are documents that are kind of roughly reflected here that have step descriptions and purposes, outcomes. There's an at-a-glance table for every single major step. There's details and descriptions of every activity. There are flowcharts with tasks, a task level detail within each activity. And there's different types of communications considerations and suggested analytical techniques that are layered in throughout. So each of the 5 steps of the CPM has a document, and all 5 of those documents are bundled up as one big document. So it's a big document that really consists of 5 separate documents inside of it. Total, it's about 70 pages in length and narrative, but it really is inclusive of these at-a-glance tables and these task level visuals, and really kind of showing and illustrating how this methodology can actually be used and can be made more effective. So today we talked about the collaborative planning methodology, the CPM. What I really want to go back to is how the CPM really reinforces the customer relationship that we're trying to drive from OCIOs to the mission customers. We see OCIOs becoming more service-focused, more customer service-focused, and we see them really trying to figure out how they can reach out to their mission customers and deliver upon the needs that they have. We talked in another video about how to reorganize an OCIO and become more customer-focused with a customer relationship function and a planning function and a doing function. The collaborative planning methodology dovetails right into this line of thinking. Collaborative planning is around working collaboratively with the mission customers and our planners. And also means working with the planners within the OCIO environment and the financial environment, working collaboratively together to develop out these integrated plans. The CPM guides methodologically the participants through a process where they are discovering what the needs really are that need to be met. They're doing research on whether or not these needs have been met in other places. They're putting together an integrated plan and then implementing that plan and measuring against that plan. Again, the CPM is meant to be more practical, more flexible, and be able to be effective at various levels of scope, much more so than the FSAM was. And from that standpoint, I think that as a planning community, we've really evolved into a planning methodology that's providing a lot more rigor, but a lot more flexibility given the types of planning that we're being required to do today. And from that standpoint, I think that the CPM is a real step forward for the planning community.